Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This video looks at the relationship between democracy and capitalism. It sheds some light on the history of the issue and also explores whether democracy and capitalism are in conflict or they are complementary. So let's look at the chronology of democracy and capitalism. In terms of the sequence, capitalism came first and democracy came later. So just to give you a timeline, the universal male suffrage was approved in Europe in around the middle of the 19th century, i.e. around 1850s. So before 1850s, only males had the right to vote and males who had property. So the working class males and the females did not have the right to vote before the 1850s. However, after 1850s, then all males, including the working class, started getting the right to vote. It started with France in 1848. All men got the right to vote. In Germany in 1871, in Greece in 1844, in Denmark 1849, in Norway in 1898. So all males got the right to vote in the second half of the 19th century, i.e. between 1850 and 1900. All men got the right to vote. However, females were still excluded from the democratic process. So even when these males were getting the right to vote, the working class men, some philosophers objected and they were not in favor of giving voting rights to the working class people because they thought that their rights would harm capitalism and destroy the market economy. So the core issue that John Stuart Mill and other European intellectuals had was as follows. So their concern was what happens when you give voting power to a working class majority. So recall that most of the people were working class, laborers, workers who had no property, and suddenly they were given voting rights. So people like John Stuart Mill, they question what will be the consequence of giving voting rights to the workers? And their concerns were as follows. First of all, the property and tax issues. So John Stuart Mill worried that workers would vote to heavily tax the property owners, i.e. the capitalists would be heavily taxed if the working class people were given the voting rights because they would favor legislation which would impose heavy taxes on the capitalists, on the wealth, and then that would mean the growth would slow down because growth is funded by savings. So if the savings go down because of heavy taxation, then obviously the market economy would stop growing or the growth would slow down. There will be reduced investment capital. In addition, John Stuart Mill also thought that um, the workers might vote to cancel the national debt, or they might favor heavy inheritance taxes. So the wealth of the people when they pass away, there will be a huge tax on the inheritance which will go to the government, i.e. again, the capitalist class will be weakened, the wealthy people's wealth will go down, and then there will not be enough to support the production and growth of the economy. The second kind of concerns about the labor market getting voting rights were as follows. So John Stuart Mill believed that workers might use their voting power to artificially raise the wages, to restrict competition in the labor market, and even block technological innovations that could threaten jobs. He also worried that the implementation of tariffs might shield local producers from foreign competition, and that would mean that the the goods and services would be more expensive in the domestic economy because the local producers would be charging a higher price, and then the imports will be more expensive. So that was the second kind of concern which Mill had. Finally, the third kind of concern which Mill had about giving voting rights to the working class was government spending. So Mill feared that workers would vote for excessive public expenditure, prioritizing short-term benefits over long-term economic growth. So if the government is spending too much, then of course the government needs taxation revenues, and that would mean the decrease in the wealth of the capitalists, which is not a good thing for long-term economic growth. Since the idea is in classical economics is that you need savings to accumulate capital, like physical capital, factories, machines, and equipment, and that leads to long-term growth. So if the savings go down or if the wealth has been redistributed, there will not be enough savings to fund the accumulation of physical capital or physical factories and machines. And that's a bad thing. So Mill thought that giving voting rights to the workers would lead to all those negative consequences. Let's now look at how democracy supports or strengthens capitalism. So I'll be discussing 3 points here. The first is that the democratic process legitimizes government actions. So once people are voting in a democracy, then they select a government comes in power, it makes decisions. The decisions of the governments obtain public acceptance and support because the people have voted that government into power. So democracy in that sense legitimizes and strengthens the government actions. It, in terms of the economic impact, this legitimacy enhances the enforcement of contracts and the protection of private property. So people are more receptive to following the rules since they believe that they are now bound by a government which they have elected. Similarly, the democratic process also helps to avoid revolutions by legitimizing government actions. So in the absence of democracy, people may rise up and overthrow the government. However, if they have elected a government for 4 or 5 years, then they would be more willing and open to accepting the actions of the government. So that's the first way by which democracy supports capitalism. The second is the development of welfare policies. Now, over time, people can lobby, people can vote en masse and promote policies which lead to the development of welfare policies. Policies like insurance against accidents, illness and old age, welfare payments, and so on. So we've seen this especially after the Great Depression, that a lot of welfare state policies were implemented throughout the Western world. And that was, of course, due to the power of the labor unions, and people were asking for more rights and more privileges. So that kind of pressure helps to legitimize again the capitalist system, and those welfare policies in turn lead to more stability, and people are satisfied and perceive fairness and justice, and they are content with capitalism. So the welfare policies make people more accepting of capitalism. The third aspect by which democracy supports capitalism is the informational feedback for policy adjustment. So as I mentioned, people provide feedback to the government, whether it's through the form of protests or through rallies or by writing to the legislators or the parliamentarians. They provide feedback to the government. So for example, let's take the issue of pollution. So if the production of plastic is causing pollution in an economy, then the people can convey to their MPs and their mayors and legislators that there is an external cost of the production of plastic. So this is called as externality in economics. So externality means that the transaction between two people, let's say one is the producer of plastic and two is the buyer of plastic, and the pollution is causing health issues to person number three. So this is called the externality. Externality in economics means the impact on the third party, the impact of an economic activity on the third party. So although person number three was not involved in either the purchase of plastic or the production of plastic, however, because of the pollution, person number three has been affected, has been hospitalized, or is suffering health issues. So that's an externality. Now, what person three would do is he would go to his local MP and complain that I have suffered from health issues because of these two guys, person number one and person number two. What the government would in turn do is the government would impose pollution taxes on the producer, and the government would ask the producer, i.e. person number one, to bear the cost of the treatment of person number three, for example. So that's called as internalizing the externality. So one and two cause an externality in the form of pollution, and then this guy goes and complains, the government passes a law, and then now one and two need to share the cost of the treatment or share the cost of the externality. So the government imposes taxes on number one, and that's how the feedback loop helps to internalize the cost of the pollution. So these guys one and two, they internalize, they bear the cost of the pollution through this feedback mechanism. Again, this supports capitalism, and it supports the ongoing manufacture of plastic and ongoing industrial production. Let's now look at the tensions between democracy and capitalism. So this idea of the tension goes back to Adam Smith, who in his Wealth of Nations, he mentioned that merchants and manufacturers can influence policies of the politicians for personal gains. So while democracy with universal suffrage can support capitalism, however, special lobby groups can influence policies for personal gains. So there is a tension, and that tension is that the special interests often conflict with the broader public good. The second point is the public choice theory, so which states that the politicians act in their self-interest, prioritizing short-term voter satisfaction over the long-term public good. So this focus on votes leads to government failures, such as inefficiency and unsustainable policies. So what this theory is saying is that the politicians rely on the votes from the voters to be elected into power. So their concern is not with the long-term economic growth of the country, rather their interest lies in appeasing the people and pandering to the people to get votes. Even if appeasing to the people leads to long-term negative consequences, the politicians are still interested in getting the votes more than they are interested in long-term efficiency and growth. So that's one um, tension between democracy and capitalism. The second point is that universal suffrage allowed all groups to lobby for narrow interests, increasing their inefficiencies. Universal suffrage and short-term political incentives often lead to suboptimal economic policies. Politicians might introduce subsidies for industries that are no longer competitive, for example, coal mining in some regions, not because it benefits the economy, but because it secures votes from workers in those industries. So, because of universal suffrage, and because of the fact that everybody can vote, they can organize and create a group and then lobby and pressurize politicians to implement policies in their favor. So to win votes, the politicians favor increased spending and tax cuts. Politicians frequently announce the reduction of taxes, which makes the constituency happy, which makes the voters happy, and politicians also increase public spending before elections to gain public favor, even if it worsens the national deficit. So again, political dividends are more important than economic stability and growth, and their actions often undermine fiscal responsibility. They reduce the taxes, increase the government spending, i.e. increasing the fiscal deficits. The third point is about the interest groups and the lobbies. So interest groups lobbying hampers economic growth. Small organized groups dominate policy making at the expense of the majority. So for example, if there is a small group of sugar producers, for example, they have a strong incentive to lobby politicians. They organize, they gain knowledge and push policies that benefit themselves, i.e. they benefit the sugar producers at the expense of the public. So they benefit significantly from tariffs on imported sugar. They want to reduce the competition in the economy so that their profits can be maximized and increased. So these sugar producers organize effectively to lobby for tariffs. They want less imports and a monopoly over the sugar. And that's why those small groups dominate policy making. On the other hand, the consumers are a large group. They do not organize for a small product like sugar. So they lack the incentive to organize against tariff, and the result is that the lobbies are much stronger and much more organized to pass policies in their favor. The next point is that the politicians are not benevolent. They are not like the philosopher king, like a kind and caring philosopher king, but rather they are self-interested and they prioritize the short-term voter satisfaction over the long-term public good or the economic growth. So governments spend more than they collect, i.e. they have government fiscal deficits, so their revenues, the tax revenues, are less than the expenditures. Now, how is this deficit funded? So there are two ways of funding deficit. One is to borrow. So they could issue bonds and borrow money and then spend it. That passes on the burden of the debt to the future generations. The second option with the governments is to print money. And if they print money and spend, that leads to inflation. So both, whether it's taking excessive bonds, issuing excessive bonds and taking loans, or excessive money printing, both are harmful in the long term for the economy. However, the politicians are happy to do that because that satisfies their constituency and the voters. The next point is about so Keynes. He had the idea that during downturns, deficit is acceptable, so the government can actually spend more than they tax, and that will bring out the economy from recession. He argued that during the good economic times there will be surpluses, so the tax revenue will be more than the expenditure, so that will offset the deficits in the long term. So, however, the Buchanan, he said that the politicians prioritize short-term popularity over fiscal responsibility, and the result is chronic deficits and unsustainable debt. So the deficits will not be offset by the surpluses in strong periods. Rather, because the politicians will continue the deficit spending, so they will continue spending more than the taxation, there will always be chronic deficits, and the surpluses will not offset the deficit. So that was the critique of Buchanan. Finally, the issue of voter ignorance. Now, most voters lack the time, resources, or incentive to deeply understand the government policies. So this irrational ignorance means that voters often remain uninformed about the economic consequences of policies. So this lack of knowledge allows the politicians to prioritize the demands of small organized groups and lobbies over the broader public interest. So while on the one hand the lobbies are organized, they lobby, they influence politics, the masses don't organize and don't pressurize and lobby to the same extent, and ensure the public welfare. So the political process is hijacked by the lobby groups because